What happens when one of the most respected actors in the world sits down for what should be a simple chat about his career, only to face a host who seems more interested in tearing him down than celebrating his achievements? In just 34 seconds, a single dismissive comment would trigger a chain of events that would see a legendary performer walk off set, leaving behind a host scrambling to justify her behavior, and a studio audience sitting in stunned silence. This is the story of the morning that changed daytime television forever. Brian Cox arrived at the studio that day, expecting nothing more than a pleasant conversation. He had been making the rounds promoting his latest project, and every interview up to this point had been respectful, engaging, warm. But from the moment he walked onto that set and took his seat across from Lorraine Kelly, something felt different. The energy was off. The smile on her face did not quite reach her eyes, and there was a tension in the air that neither the cameras nor the studio audience could ignore. The interview started innocently enough. Lorraine Kelly opened with what seemed like a standard question about Brian Cox's latest role, asking him to tell the viewers what drew him to the project. Brian Cox, ever the professional, leaned forward and began to speak with that distinctive voice of his, the one that has commanded attention on stages and screens for decades. He talked about the script, about the depth of the character, about the creative team behind the production. He was thoughtful, articulate, genuine, but as he spoke, something strange began to happen. Lorraine Kelly was not listening. She was glancing at her notes, fidgeting with her pen, looking anywhere but at the man sitting right in front of her. And when Brian Cox finished his answer, there was a pause, a brief moment where she should have responded with interest or asked a follow-up question. Instead, she let out a small laugh, almost a scoff, and said something that would set the tone for everything that followed. "Well, that all sounds very self-important, doesn't it?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Brian Cox's expression shifted, just slightly. His eyes narrowed. He tilted his head, as if trying to make sure he had heard her correctly. The studio audience, which had been murmuring softly before, went completely silent. Even the crew members standing off to the side exchanged glances. Had she really just said that? Brian Cox took a breath. He was not the type to rise to provocation easily. He had been in this industry for too long, had dealt with too many difficult personalities to let something like this rattle him. So he smiled, a tight, controlled smile, and responded calmly. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean by that." Lorraine Kelly waved a hand dismissively, as if his confusion was somehow amusing to her. "Oh, come on, Brian. You actors, you always talk about your craft like it's some kind of sacred ritual. It's just a job, isn't it? You learn some lines, you say them in front of a camera, you get paid. Why do you all have to make it sound so dramatic?" There it was, the first real blow. And it was not just an offhand comment, it was a deliberate attempt to diminish everything Brian Cox had spent his life working for, to reduce decades of dedication, of honing a skill, of bringing stories to life, into something trivial and meaningless. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few people gasped quietly. This was not banter. This was an attack. Brian Cox did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, every word was measured, deliberate, laced with a quiet intensity that made it clear he was not going to let this slide. "With respect, Lorraine, I think you're misunderstanding what it means to be an actor. Yes, we learn lines. Yes, we perform. But it's not just about saying words. It's about understanding human nature, about empathy, about connecting with people. It's about telling stories that matter, that make people think, that make people feel. To call it just a job is to ignore everything that makes this art form valuable." It was a perfect response. Gracious, intelligent, firm. He had defended his profession without being defensive. He had stood his ground without being aggressive. Any reasonable host would have backed down at that point, would have acknowledged the validity of his perspective, and moved the conversation forward. But Lorraine Kelly was not interested in being reasonable. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, and let out another one of those dismissive laughs. "Art form? Oh, please. You're not curing cancer, Brian. You're playing pretend for a living. Let's not get too carried away with ourselves here." The room went cold. Even the producers in the control room must have felt it. This was no longer a conversation. This was a public humiliation attempt, broadcast live to millions of viewers. And Brian Cox, sitting there in his chair, could feel the weight of it. He could see where this was going. But he was not about to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. "I think," he said slowly, "that you're being deliberately provocative, and I'm not sure why. I came here to have a conversation about my work, not to be insulted. Lorraine Kelly shrugged, as if his discomfort was of no consequence to her. I'm just being honest, Brian. Someone has to say it. You actors live in this bubble where you think everything you do is so important, so meaningful. But most people watching at home, they don't care about your process or your method or whatever you want to call it. They just want to be entertained. It was condescending. It was reductive. It was wrong. And Brian Cox had heard enough. If that's what you truly believe, he said, his voice steady but firm, then I'm not sure why you invited me here in the first place. Clearly, you have no interest in hearing what I have to say. For the first time, Lorraine Kelly seemed to realize that she might have pushed too far. Her expression flickered, just for a moment. A hint of uncertainty crossed her face. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing or trying to reset the tone of the interview, she doubled down. Oh, don't be so sensitive, Brian. This is live television. If you can't handle a little bit of honest conversation, maybe you should stick to scripted material. That was it. That was the moment. The final straw. Brian Cox did not explode. He did not shout or swear or throw anything. He simply stood up, calmly, quietly. He removed the microphone from his lapel, placed it on the arm of the chair, and looked directly at Lorraine Kelly with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and disgust. I've been in this industry for over 50 years, he said, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. I've worked with some of the most talented, dedicated people you could ever meet. And I've also encountered people who think that rudeness is the same thing as honesty, that belittling others is the same thing as being clever. You're one of those people, Lorraine, and I won't sit here and let you disrespect me or my profession any longer. The studio was frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of this unfolding disaster. Lorraine Kelly opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. She looked stunned, caught completely off guard by the fact that her guest had just called her out on live television. Brian Cox turned to the audience, gave them a small nod, and then walked off the set. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The crew parted to let him through, and then he was gone, leaving behind a host who suddenly looked very small in her chair, a studio full of shocked onlookers, and a broadcast that had just become the most talked about moment in daytime television history. Lorraine Kelly tried to recover. She turned to the camera, forced a smile, and attempted to laugh it off. Well, that was unexpected, she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. Bit of a dramatic exit there. I suppose that's actors for you, always looking for the big moment. But nobody was buying it. Not the audience in the studio, not the viewers at home, not the producers frantically trying to figure out how to salvage the rest of the show. She had pushed too far, been too cruel, too dismissive, and Brian Cox, in walking away, had made it clear that he would not tolerate that kind of treatment. He had stood up for himself, for his craft, for every actor who has ever been told that what they do does not matter. The cameras cut to a commercial break, but the damage was done. The story was already spreading. Social media was exploding with reactions. People were outraged, not at Brian Cox for leaving, but at Lorraine Kelly for creating the situation in the first place. How could she have been so disrespectful to a guest? How could she have belittled an entire profession? How could she have thought that kind of behavior was acceptable on live television? Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was chaotic. Producers were arguing. Assistants were scrambling. Someone was trying to reach Brian Cox's team to see if there was any way to get him to come back, to finish the interview, to smooth things over. But the answer was clear. He was not coming back. He had said what he needed to say, and he had left. There was nothing more to discuss. When the show came back from the commercial break, Lorraine Kelly tried to move on to the next segment as if nothing had happened. But her confidence was shaken. Her smile was strained. She stumbled over her words, lost her place in her notes, seemed unable to focus. The rest of the program limped along awkwardly, with everyone involved acutely aware that the only thing anyone would remember from this episode was the moment Brian Cox walked out. And as the show finally came to an end, as the credits rolled and the camera stopped recording, Lorraine Kelly sat alone at her desk, the studio lights harsh and unforgiving. She had wanted to be provocative, to create a memorable moment, to show that she was not afraid to challenge her guests. But instead, she had revealed something else entirely. She had shown herself to be someone who mistook cruelty for wit, who believed that her position as host gave her the right to demean others, who had no respect for the people who agreed to come on her show. Brian Cox, meanwhile, had left the building. He did not give any interviews about what had happened. He did not issue a statement or go on social media to vent his frustrations. He simply went on with his life, secure in the knowledge that he had done the right thing. He had stood up for himself with dignity and grace, and he had shown the world that there are some lines that should not be crossed, no matter how big the platform or how bright the lights. The contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, a host who thought she could say whatever she wanted without consequences. On the other, a guest who knew his worth and refused to be diminished. And in the end, it was not even a contest. Brian Cox walked away with his integrity intact, while Lorraine Kelly was left to face the fallout of her own actions. This was not just a moment of tension between two people. It was a clash of values. It was about respect, about professionalism, about understanding that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human decency, regardless of who they are or what they do. Brian Cox had come to that studio expecting a conversation. Instead, he found himself facing someone who seemed to take pleasure in tearing others down. And rather than play along, rather than smile and pretend everything was fine, he made a choice. He chose himself. He chose his dignity. He chose to walk away. It was a powerful statement, and it resonated far beyond that studio, beyond that show, beyond that day. People saw in Brian Cox's actions a reminder that we do not have to accept disrespect. We do not have to sit quietly while someone belittles us or our work. We have the right to stand up, to speak out, to walk away when we are not being treated the way we deserve. The interview had started with such promise. A legendary actor, a popular morning show, a chance for viewers to hear insights from someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting his craft. But within minutes, it had devolved into something ugly. Not because Brian Cox had done anything wrong, but because the person sitting across from him had decided that her role as host gave her license to be cruel. Every question Lorraine Kelly had asked, every comment she had made, had been designed to provoke, to undermine, to diminish. She had not been interested in learning about Brian Cox's experiences or hearing his perspectives. She had been interested only in asserting her own superiority, in reminding everyone that she was in control, that she could say what she wanted. It was the behavior of someone drunk on their own power, someone who had forgotten that being a host is not about dominating your guests, but about facilitating meaningful conversations. And Brian Cox had seen through it immediately. From that very first dismissive comment about being self-important, he had understood exactly what kind of interview this was going to be. He had tried to steer it back to solid ground, had tried to respond thoughtfully and respectfully, but Lorraine Kelly had not been interested in that. She had wanted conflict. She had wanted drama. And when Brian Cox refused to give her the kind of explosive reaction she was hoping for, she had simply escalated her attacks until he had no choice but to leave. That was the part that made this whole situation so infuriating to so many people. Brian Cox had not stormed off in a fit of anger. He had not hurled insults or made a scene. He had simply, calmly, quietly refused to participate any longer. He had removed himself from a toxic situation with grace and composure, and in doing so, he had made Lorraine Kelly look exactly like what she was in that moment. Someone who could not handle a guest, who would not be bullied. The silence that followed his exit said everything. The studio audience, which had been growing more uncomfortable with each passing minute, seemed collectively relieved that someone had finally said what needed to be said. The crew members, who had watched the whole thing unfold with increasing horror, looked at each other with expressions that clearly communicated what a disaster this had been. And Lorraine Kelly, sitting there alone, trying desperately to salvage the situation with weak jokes and forced laughter, could not hide the fact that she knew she had made a terrible mistake. What made this moment even more significant was who Brian Cox is. This is not someone prone to drama or controversy. This is someone known for his professionalism, his thoughtfulness, his dedication to his work. For someone like him to walk off a set, it had to be truly unbearable. It was a testament to just how badly Lorraine Kelly had handled the situation, how deeply disrespectful she had been. If she could drive someone as patient and composed as Brian Cox to that point, what did that say about her? The entire exchange had been a masterclass in contrasts. Brian Cox had been articulate, respectful, thoughtful. Lorraine Kelly had been dismissive, condescending, cruel. Brian Cox had tried to have a genuine conversation. Lorraine Kelly had tried to score cheap points. Brian Cox had maintained his dignity throughout. Lorraine Kelly had lost hers the moment she decided that insulting her guest was acceptable behavior. And the worst part? She had genuinely seemed to believe that she was in the right. That comment about him being too sensitive, about not being able to handle honest conversation, revealed everything about her mindset. She had convinced herself that rudeness was honesty, that insults were just frank observations, that she was simply saying what everyone else was thinking. But she was wrong. Painfully, obviously wrong. And Brian Cox walking off that set was proof of that. It was a reminder that hosts have a responsibility. They have power over the guests who come on their shows. They control the tone, the direction, the atmosphere. And with that power comes an obligation to treat people fairly, to give them space to speak, to engage with them respectfully. Lorraine Kelly had failed in every one of those obligations. She had used her position not to elevate the conversation, but to belittle her guest. And in the end, she had paid the price for it. This was not about a celebrity having a tantrum or being unable to take criticism. This was about a professional deciding that he would not allow himself to be disrespected on live television. It was about boundaries, about self-respect, about knowing when to say enough is enough. And Brian Cox had done exactly that. He had drawn a line, and when Lorraine Kelly crossed it, he had walked away. Simple as that. The power of that moment lay in its simplicity. There were no theatrics, no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures, just a man standing up, removing his microphone, and leaving. But that quiet action spoke volumes. It said that no amount of fame or success or exposure is worth compromising your dignity. It said that you do not owe anyone your presence if they refuse to treat you with basic respect. It said that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply walk away. And that is why this moment resonated with so many people. Because everyone has been in a situation where they felt disrespected, where they felt like they were being treated poorly, but felt obligated to stay, to smile, to pretend everything was fine. Watching Brian Cox refuse to do that, watching him prioritize his own well-being over the demands of the show, was empowering. It was a reminder that we all have that power, that we all have the right to remove ourselves from situations that are harmful or toxic. The fact that it happened on live television, in front of millions of viewers, only amplified its impact. There was no editing, no spin, no way to hide what had really happened. Everyone saw it unfold in real time. They saw Lorraine Kelly's comments getting progressively more insulting. They saw Brian Cox's patience wearing thin. They saw the moment he made the decision to leave. And they saw Lorraine Kelly's pathetic attempt to laugh it off afterward. It was all there, recorded and preserved. A perfect example of what happens when someone in power abuses that power and someone else refuses to accept it. In those final moments before he left, when Brian Cox stood up and delivered his parting words, there was a weight to them that came from decades of experience, from a lifetime of knowing his own worth. He was not speaking just for himself. He was speaking for every actor who had ever been dismissed as playing pretend, for every artist who had been told their work did not matter, for every person who had been made to feel small by someone who thought they were bigger. His words were a defense not just of himself, but of the entire craft, of the idea that what artists do has value and meaning and deserves respect. And Lorraine Kelly's inability to understand that, her insistence on treating acting as something frivolous and unimportant, revealed a fundamental lack of appreciation for storytelling, for performance, for the ways in which art enriches our lives. She had reduced something profound to something trivial, and in doing so, she had shown her own limitations as an interviewer and as a person. The whole situation could have been avoided so easily. All Lorraine Kelly had to do was be respectful. All she had to do was ask genuine questions and listen to the answers. All she had to do was treat her guests the way any decent person would treat another human being. But she could not do that. She chose instead to be antagonistic, to be provocative, to be cruel. And she learned, in the most public way possible, that there are consequences for that kind of behavior. Brian Cox walking off that set was not just a moment. It was a statement. It was a line in the sand. It was a reminder that respect is not optional, that dignity is not negotiable, that some things are more important than staying on camera or finishing an interview or keeping up appearances. And everyone who witnessed it understood that. They understood that what they had just seen was not a celebrity meltdown or a publicity stunt. It was a man standing up for himself with quiet strength and unshakable conviction. The cameras captured it all: the discomfort, the tension, the breaking point, the exit. And in the days that followed, those images would be replayed over and over, analyzed and discussed and debated. But the conclusion was always the same. Brian Cox had done nothing wrong. He had been respectful, patient, thoughtful. He had tried to engage in good faith. And when it became clear that he was not being afforded the same courtesy, He had made the only choice that made sense. He had left. That is what made this such a defining moment. Not the drama, not the conflict, but the clarity. The absolute clarity of right and wrong, of appropriate and inappropriate, of respectful and disrespectful. There was no ambiguity here. Lorraine Kelly had been in the wrong from start to finish, and Brian Cox had responded with a level of grace and composure that only someone with true confidence and self-worth could muster. As he walked out of that studio, he left behind more than just a shocked host and a stunned audience. He left behind a lesson about the importance of treating people with respect, a lesson about the value of standing up for yourself, a lesson about knowing when to walk away, and most importantly, a lesson about the fact that no platform, no matter how big, gives anyone the right to be cruel,